Hey guys, this is Matt Core from ControlPaint.com, and this premium series is really important to me. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and hopefully it will help demystify perspective. So the first reasonable question is, what is perspective? And in truth, it's just a system of measurement. It is a tool that allows you to put things convincingly in three-dimensional space. Artists oftentimes will avoid perspective because they mistakenly think it needs to be incredibly rigid. They like sketching, but they don't like rulers and rules. So perspective is somehow different than sketching. Well, in this series, I'd like to show that you can do perspective sketching with just as much energy as you would a normal drawing, because perspective is part of every normal drawing. Here's a painting of mine. Now, if you look at just the understructure of this image, it follows the rules of linear perspective. It may not be quite so obvious in the final, but I use this as a tool to make it look like it's a convincing 3D space. And as you learn these rules, you can essentially see it everywhere you look. Now, you might have noticed that this series you have here is one half of a larger two-part miniseries. Well, if you don't already know, this first half is just the rules. Here we're going to talk about the basic fundamentals that make all this perspective stuff function. In Perspective Sketching 2, Form and Design, I'm going to actually put these techniques together and show you it sort of happening in the real world. I'll prove that the same rules apply to characters and environments and vehicles. It's all the same stuff. So I'd recommend watching both parts of this because they do stand alone pretty well, but they were really designed to be watched as a pair. So before we get to any of the advanced stuff, let's just get into the basics of how linear perspective works. And I'm going to start off by showing just a basic demonstration sped up a bit so you can just see what this process looks like. Because it's very likely that you've had a little perspective experience and it involved lots of rulers and very tight, careful drawing. Well, this might look a little different. So you can see here that I'm starting with a grid. It looks almost like graph paper, but it's sort of in perspective already. Well, in a way, this is going to give me what the rulers normally would have in a sort of traditional perspective drawing. But as you can see here, I'm not using any rulers. I'm mainly using those lines to help guide my sense of perspective. They give me sort of like a foundation to build on top of. But you can see I'm just doing freehand sketching. So in this case, I'm doing sort of a environment drawing, and it's got both hard edges, but also soft organic forms. Because a lot of people feel like maybe perspective is good for drawing train tracks, but it's not very good for drawing anything with round edges. But the truth is, perspective is no more than a measuring system. To draw in perspective is to draw any subject matter. You are definitely not limited to drawing angular mechanical forms. Hopefully, over the course of this series, you'll understand that drawing in perspective is just normal drawing. There's nothing scary about it. It's not really tight and technical. Really, it's just one tool in your drawing toolbox. In the same way that if you were drawing from life, you would do some visual measuring or think about proportions. Those are no more technical than perspective. Yet people have a mental block against the word. So we're going to break that down and work on freehand perspective. So here we're going to look at some very classic perspective imagery. Train tracks receding into the distance. This is about as basic as it gets, but it proves a really important aspect of perspective, which is that we are portraying depth. Because if you change your viewpoint, train tracks are parallel lines. Here we'll look down from the top, and you can see that these lines are not converging towards one another. It's only when you change your viewpoint, and you can see the horizon off in the distance, that these parallel lines begin to move towards one another. In fact, what they're moving towards is called the vanishing point. Now, this is particularly visible with things like train tracks, but the reality is, perspective is largely based on understanding what parallel lines do. Lines that if you were to look at them from the top down, they'd be totally parallel, just like train tracks. But when you change your viewpoint, they follow different rules. In a nutshell, that's perspective. So here's a different example. This is a 6-sided cube. Now, as we look at it, we can only see a few of the faces. But do you see these lines of different colors? These are all parallel lines. If we were to remove the perspective from this image, these edges would all line up. Or like the train tracks, if we saw them from a different vantage point, they would appear more parallel. But as we change our vantage point, you can see that these parallel lines begin to recede towards a vanishing point. And each set of parallel lines recedes towards its own vanishing point. Now, if I were to pull the camera way back, you could actually watch these recede all the way till they reach those vanishing points. But in most realistic settings, you're not going to see these two vanishing points inside of your picture plane. Generally, they're way off the paper. And if you've ever tried doing perspective with rulers, this is one of the big stumbling blocks. You would need a really long ruler, and also you would have to go way outside of the paper, so you'd need a really big desk. So we're going to avoid these problems by learning to sketch perspective in freehand. But before we get to freehand, I'm going to show you how you would draw this box from scratch with the traditional method. So here you've got your picture plane. If you were working on paper, this would be your paper. Everything outside of it is the desk. So I'm going to start by drawing a horizon line, and that does not need to be in your image. It can be wherever you want. This is just a reference point to help us know where we're looking from. What's the vantage point? And now inside my picture plane, I'm going to draw one line of this cube. This is a vertical that's going to divide two faces from one another. Okay? Now I'll take the bottom of that line and connect it all the way out to the right vanishing point. I'm going to do the same thing with the top half of that line. Okay, now we've got sort of like a train track receding towards the vanishing point, only it's vertical. Okay, I'm going to do that with the other side. So here I've got almost like the corner of a very long building. Well, I don't want my cube to be infinitely long, so I can pick anywhere on this depth dimension and draw another vertical line, and that effectively says where the depth of the box stops. I can do that on the other side as well. And now I've defined the left and right sides of this box. The only thing I haven't defined is what the top looks like. So the way I do that is I'm going to start from each vanishing point. And after it makes an intersection, I'll erase the rest. That's great. I've got a cube. But as you could see, this process was far from loose. This wasn't really anything like sketching. This was more like making a diagram. Even if this is not the method we're going to use, there's one important takeaway here. See these sets of parallel lines? If you follow them as far as you can look, they end up at a vanishing point. So all the right-facing parallel lines on this cube go to one vanishing point, and all the left-facing parallel lines go to another vanishing point. So in the next lesson, we're going to take this same idea, draw a 6-sided cube, but we're going to do it without the vanishing points.